A powerful story of racism, hidden identities, and instant karma unfolds in the corporate offices of Horizon Enterprises. Malcolm Davis, a young black man, steps into a world where he's underestimated and disrespected by his racist boss, Stephen Russell. Little does Stephen know, the man he's belittling is not just any employee, he's the CEO's son. As Stephen continues to bully and sabotage Malcolm, the tables turn in a way that will leave everyone in shock. By the time the truth is revealed, Stephen's entire career will come crashing down, and Malcolm will stand tall, having proven his worth despite the odds stacked against him. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Malcolm Davis stood at the entrance of Horizon Enterprises, feeling both nervous and excited about the new journey he was about to embark on. The towering glass structure reflected the sun's glare, momentarily blinding him as he looked up. He adjusted his tie, taking a deep breath before walking through the revolving doors. And this wasn't just any internship for Malcolm. It was his chance to prove that he belonged in a world where people like him were often underestimated. As a young black man entering the predominantly white corporate world, Malcolm knew this wasn't just about excelling in his role. It was about proving that he belonged in a space where people like him were often overlooked, dismissed, or worse, seen as filling a diversity quota. The weight of that reality sat on his shoulders as he approached the reception desk. "Malcolm Davis," he said to the receptionist, offering a polite smile. The woman glanced up briefly from her computer, giving a professional but curt nod. "You're with the new interns, correct?" she asked, her eyes flicking over his suit and face for a moment longer than necessary. Malcolm couldn't tell if it was judgment, curiosity, or indifference, but he had learned to ignore those moments. "Yes, I'm starting today," he replied calmly. "Take the elevator to the 22nd floor. You'll be meeting with Stephen Russell, the regional manager," she said, her tone businesslike, as she went back to her work without another glance. Malcolm thanked her and made his way to the elevator, trying to shake the creeping sense of anxiety. He had faced bias before, and he knew that despite all his qualifications, today could be more of the same. But there was something Stephen Russell didn't know, something that Malcolm had kept carefully hidden. He was the son of David Davis, the CEO of Horizon Enterprises. However, Malcolm had chosen not to reveal that detail. He wanted to make it here based on his merit, not his connections. The elevator doors slid open, and Malcolm stepped into the fast-paced world of the 22nd floor. The open-plan office was bustling with activity, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, and professionals in sharp suits huddled over presentations. It was the kind of environment that thrived on results, and Malcolm knew that all eyes would be on him as the new guy. More than that, he knew that his race would make him stand out even more. His first introduction to Stephen Russell happened almost immediately. Stephen was waiting near the reception area, tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp, calculating gaze. His suit was tailored to perfection, and the way he carried himself spoke of someone who believed he was untouchable. The smug smile on his face only made it clearer. "So you're Malcolm Davis," Stephen said, his voice laced with something just short of sarcasm. He didn't bother extending his hand, a gesture that Malcolm noticed but chose to overlook. "Yes, sir," Malcolm replied, evenly, keeping his tone polite but firm. He was determined not to let this man see any weakness. Stephen looked him up and down, his eyes lingering just a little too long. "They finally got themselves a diversity hire, huh? Well, let's hope you can keep up," he said with a smirk that made Malcolm's stomach tighten. Malcolm blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of Stephen's comment. He had expected challenges, but not this level of open disrespect right out of the gate. "I'm here because I earned it," Malcolm replied, his voice steady despite the wave of irritation rising within him. Stephen chuckled darkly. "Sure you are," he said dismissively. "Well, let's get one thing straight. This isn't a handout. You're going to have to prove yourself here, just like everyone else. I don't care where you came from or who put in a good word for you." Malcolm's fist clenched at his sides, but he kept his expression neutral. He had worked hard for this opportunity, and he wasn't going to let a man like Stephen make him doubt that. What Stephen didn't know was that Malcolm wasn't here to rely on any favors. He had kept his father's identity a secret for a reason. As they walked through the Stephen led Malcolm to a small windowless cubicle in a corner of the floor, away from the hustle of the main workspace. The space was cramped, with barely enough room for the outdated computer and piles of paperwork that had already accumulated. It was clear from the placement that Stephen had no intention of giving Malcolm the benefit of the doubt. "Here's your spot," Stephen said, his tone condescending. "Not much, but it's what you'll get. You'll be working on reports and assisting with any projects I throw your way. Let's hope you can keep up because we don't have time for charity cases here." Malcolm bit back the retort that sat on the tip of his tongue. "I'll do my best," he said, sitting down at the desk. Stephen smirked, leaning against the cubicle wall. "We'll see about that. The last intern didn't last long, but I'm sure you'll manage, right? After all, I'm sure you've had plenty of opportunities handed to you." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He had been prepared for this, but it didn't make it any easier. "I'm here to work, just like everyone else." Stephen gave a mocking laugh and walked away, leaving Malcolm with a growing sense of frustration. This wasn't going to be easy. He had known that from the start, but the reality of dealing with someone like Stephen day in and day out was going to test his patience in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Sitting at his desk, Malcolm took a deep breath and opened his laptop. He wasn't here to make friends or to prove anything to Stephen. He was here to do his job, to show that he could excel despite the barriers placed in front of him. And in time, they would all see that he was more than just a diversity hire. Malcolm sat at his cramped cubicle, the weight of his encounter with Stephen still lingering in the back of his mind. He had faced people like Stephen before, men who thrived on a sense of superiority, who believed that his presence in spaces like this was purely to satisfy a diversity quota. But Malcolm wasn't here to play into their expectations. He was here to work, to learn, and to succeed on his own terms. As he started on the first report assigned to him, Malcolm's focus shifted entirely to the task at hand. His father had always taught him the importance of hard work and discipline, values that had gotten him through school and opened doors that others thought should remain closed to someone like him. Malcolm's career ambitions stretched far beyond this internship. He wanted to build something for himself, to stand on his own merit, without being defined by the prejudices of others. The morning hours passed slowly, with Malcolm working diligently through the files that Stephen had dumped on his desk. He could feel the eyes of his coworkers glancing at him from time to time, though most kept their distance. He wasn't surprised. In corporate spaces like these, it was often easier for people to stick to their own circles and avoid newcomers, especially when those newcomers didn't fit the typical mold. But Malcolm wasn't looking for validation from them. It wasn't long before Stephen reappeared, looming over Malcolm's desk like a shadow. His expression was as smug as ever, and the mocking tone in his voice hadn't lessened. "How's it coming along?" he asked, pretending to sound interested, though it was clear he expected nothing impressive. Malcolm glanced up briefly, his fingers still working over the keyboard. "I'm almost finished with the first report, just double-checking the data before I send it to you." Stephen crossed his arms and leaned against the cubicle wall, surveying Malcolm's workspace with barely concealed disdain. "Double-checking, huh? Don't worry too much about getting it perfect," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure they won't be expecting much from you anyway." Malcolm felt a flicker of irritation but refused to show it. He wasn't about to give Stephen the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten under his skin. Instead, he nodded politely. "I'll have it done soon." Stephen smirked, clearly enjoying his little power trip. "Good. We wouldn't want you falling behind, now would we? After all, you've got a lot to prove." With that, Stephen turned and walked away, leaving Malcolm to swallow down the rising frustration. He was used to this kind of treatment, but it never got easier. Still, he reminded himself that this was a test, both of his patience and his abilities. He wasn't here to argue with Stephen or let himself be dragged down by the man's obvious bias. His work would speak for itself in the end. Just as Malcolm was about to submit the finished report, a small notification popped up on his screen. An email from his father, David Davis. It was short and to the point, as most of his father's emails were. "Malcolm, I've heard you're settling in well. Remember what we discussed. Stay focused on your goals. Let the work speak louder than words. Proud of you. Dad." "Dad." Malcolm smiled slightly. His father's words were always a source of encouragement, even when they came in the form of brief, business-like emails. David Davis had never been one to coddle his son. Instead, he had raised Malcolm with the belief that success wasn't given. It was earned, and no matter how difficult the journey, Malcolm had to push through. With renewed determination, Malcolm sent off the completed report and immediately moved on to the next task. There was no room for error in a place like this, and he was determined not to give Stephen any reason to question his competence. He would finish everything early, and he would make sure it was perfect. As the day wore on, Malcolm settled into a rhythm. The work itself wasn't difficult, just tedious and time-consuming. But every now and then, he caught a glimpse of Stephen watching him from across the office, as if waiting for Malcolm to slip up. It was unsettling, knowing that someone was looking for reasons to see him fail, but Malcolm refused to give Stephen what he wanted. Near the end of the day, just as Malcolm was finishing up his second assignment, Stephen strolled by his cubicle, a sneer on his face. "Not bad for your first day," he said, glancing at the papers on Malcolm's desk. I'll admit you might last longer than I thought. Malcolm didn't respond, simply nodding as he closed his laptop for the day. He didn't want to engage in Stephen's mind games. There was no point in sparring with someone who was determined to misunderstand him. But as Stephen lingered for a moment longer, Malcolm could sense that the man was still sizing him up. "You know," Stephen said, lowering his voice slightly, "people like you, people who get here because of who they know, they never last. They think they belong, but they never do." Malcolm's chest tightened at the comment, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm here to do my job," he said, standing up from his desk and gathering his things. "That's all." Stephen's smirk widened. "Sure, kid, keep telling yourself that." With that, Stephen finally walked away, leaving Malcolm alone in the now quiet office. As he left the building, Malcolm's thoughts swirled with a mix of anger and determination. He wasn't going to let Stephen's words shake him. He had dealt with men like Stephen before, and he had come out stronger every time. This was no different. What Stephen didn't know was that Malcolm wasn't here by accident, and one day, that truth would come crashing down around him. The next morning, Malcolm arrived early to the office, determined to start the day strong. Despite Stephen's constant attempts to belittle him, Malcolm knew he couldn't let his guard down. Not for a moment. If he showed any weakness, Stephen would seize on it immediately. But more importantly, Malcolm wasn't going to allow one man's prejudice to derail his focus or his ambitions. He had his eye on a bigger prize, and no amount of petty office politics was going to change that. The office was still quiet when Malcolm sat down at his desk. A few employees were milling about, preparing for the day ahead, but it wouldn't get busy for another hour. He relished this moment of calm, using the time to review his tasks for the day. Preparation was key, another lesson his father had drilled into him since he was a child. Always stay ahead of the game, Malcolm. Don't wait for things to happen, make them happen. But the peace didn't last long. Barely an hour into the morning, Stephen appeared at Malcolm's desk, his usual condescending smirk plastered across his face. He tossed a thick file onto the desk with a heavy thud, startling Malcolm slightly. "I need this done by the end of the day," Stephen said, leaning in as if to emphasize the urgency. "It's important, so make sure you don't screw it up. This client's been with us for years, and they don't tolerate mistakes. Understand?" Malcolm looked down at the file and nodded. "I'll take care of it." Stephen straightened up, his smirk deepening. "Good. I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself this early in your career." He lingered for a moment longer, clearly enjoying the power he thought he held over Malcolm, before turning and walking away. Malcolm took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. This was the game Stephen wanted to play, to put pressure on him, to make him feel inadequate, and to watch him stumble. But Malcolm wasn't going to stumble. He opened the file, quickly scanning through the details of the project. It was complicated, but nothing he couldn't handle. For the next few hours, Malcolm worked through the project meticulously, ensuring that every number, every figure, every line of data was accurate. He knew that Stephen was looking for any excuse to criticize him, so there was no room for even the smallest mistake. Just before lunch, Malcolm was nearly finished when Stephen reappeared at his desk, accompanied by two of the other interns, both of whom had become part of Stephen's inner circle. They stood behind Stephen, watching with thinly veiled amusement as their boss leaned against the cubicle wall. "So how is it going, Malcolm?" Stephen asked, his voice laced with mock sincerity. "Think you'll have it done on time?" Malcolm glanced up briefly. "I'm almost finished. I'll have it done before the deadline." Stephen's smirk widened. "Almost finished, huh? Well, you'd better hope it's done right. This client doesn't have much patience for mistakes, and if you mess this up, it's not going to reflect well on you." Malcolm didn't let Stephen's words get to him. He kept his tone calm and professional. "It'll be done right." Stephen chuckled, turning to the interns behind him. "You hear that? He thinks he's got it all under control. Let's see how long that confidence lasts." The interns exchanged glances, clearly amused by Stephen's constant jabs at Malcolm. It was obvious that they didn't see him as a threat, but rather as a joke, someone who didn't belong in the same space they did, but Malcolm remained focused. He had learned long ago not to rise to provocations. His work would speak for itself, and soon enough, Stephen's taunts wouldn't matter. After Stephen and the interns left, Malcolm finished up the project and reviewed it carefully before sending it off. He knew it was solid work, thorough and accurate, with no room for error. He couldn't control what Stephen thought, but he could control the quality of his work. Later that afternoon, Malcolm received an email from David Davis, his father. It was brief as usual, but its timing was perfect. "Proud of how you're handling yourself, son. Keep your head up, Dad." Malcolm smiled. His father knew what he was going through, even from a distance. David had been watching carefully, waiting for the right moment to intervene. But for now, he was letting Malcolm fight his own battles. This was about Malcolm proving himself, and his father respected that. The rest of the day passed in relative silence, with Malcolm focusing on his next tasks while keeping his head down. He knew Stephen would eventually return, probably with another round of condescending remarks or unnecessary critiques, but Malcolm was prepared for it. Sure enough, just as the office began to wind down for the day, Stephen strolled over to Malcolm's desk, a smug look on his face. "Got your report," he said, waving the file in the air. "Let's see if it's any good, shall we?" He flipped through the pages quickly, barely skimming the content, but making a show of looking for mistakes. Malcolm watched him carefully, knowing that Stephen wasn't actually interested in the quality of the work. He was just looking for an opportunity to tear Malcolm down. After a long moment, Stephen closed the file and smirked. "Not bad for a first try," he said, though his tone suggested that he didn't actually mean it. "But let's see if you can keep this up. One good day doesn't mean much around here." Malcolm nodded. "I'll keep doing my best." Stephen raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Sure. Just remember, you're not here because of your qualifications. You're here because they needed to fill a quota. Keep that in mind." With that, Stephen walked away, leaving Malcolm feeling a familiar sense of frustration. He had been here before, dealing with men like Stephen, people who couldn't see past their own prejudices, who assumed that success was something reserved for a select few. But Malcolm wasn't going to let Stephen's small-mindedness define his experience at Horizon Enterprises. As the office emptied out for the day, Malcolm packed up his things and left quietly. His mind was racing with thoughts about the future, about what he wanted to accomplish here, and how he was going to navigate the challenges ahead. He wasn't just here to survive, he was here to win. The next few days at Horizon Enterprises felt like a constant game of cat and mouse. Every time Malcolm thought he had found a rhythm in his work, Stephen would swoop in with a new assignment or an unnecessary critique, each one designed to throw Malcolm off balance. It was clear that Stephen wasn't interested in seeing Malcolm succeed. He was more interested in proving that he didn't belong there. On Wednesday morning, Malcolm arrived at his desk to find a towering stack of papers already waiting for him. Stephen must have left it there before Malcolm arrived, knowing it would overwhelm him before the day even started. Malcolm sighed quietly as he sat down, mentally preparing himself for another day of heavy workloads and constant scrutiny. Before he could even make a dent in the pile, Stephen appeared, looming over his desk as usual. "Morning, Malcolm," he said with a tone that suggested anything but friendliness. "I see you've got your work cut out for you today. Let's see if you can handle it." Malcolm looked up, his expression neutral. "I'll get it done." Stephen smirked as if the challenge had been issued. "You better. This is an important project, and I wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself in front of the higher-ups." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You know, people like you don't usually get second chances in places like this. One mistake and they'll toss you aside." Malcolm didn't flinch. "I'm aware. I'll make sure it's done right." Stephen's smirk deepened. "Good. I'll be keeping an eye on you." He lingered for a moment longer, clearly enjoying the sense of power he thought he held over Malcolm, before finally walking away. Malcolm took a deep breath and turned back to the stack of papers. It was frustrating, this constant need to prove himself, not because of the quality of his work, but because of the color of his skin. But Malcolm wasn't new to this game. He had dealt with this kind of discrimination before, and he knew how to stay focused despite it. As the day wore on, Malcolm worked through the stack methodically, making sure every detail was correct. He knew that Stephen was looking for any excuse to criticize him, and he wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. He was determined to rise above it. Around noon, Malcolm took a short break to stretch his legs and grab a coffee. As he walked through the break room, he overheard a group of interns talking in hushed voices. He recognized one of them, Brian, a fellow intern who had been friendly to him on the first day, but now the tone of their conversation had changed. "Did you see how much work Stephen dumped on Malcolm?" Brian whispered to the others. "I swear, he's setting him up to fail. There's no way he can finish all of that." One of the other interns snickered. "Yeah, well, that's what happens when you get hired because of diversity quotas. They don't expect you to actually keep up." Malcolm's stomach turned at the words. It was one thing to face Stephen's prejudice head-on, but it was another to hear it echoed in the voices of his peers. He had hoped that at least some of the interns would see him for who he was, not for the assumptions they made about him. But this was the reality he had been prepared for. He had always known that being underestimated was part of the battle. Shaking off the frustration, Malcolm grabbed his coffee and returned to his desk, determined not to let the whispers get to him. He couldn't control what people thought of him, but he could control how he responded, and he wasn't going to let anyone else's opinion define him. Back at his desk, Malcolm noticed an email notification pop up on his computer screen. It was from his father, David Davis, and though it was short, it carried a weight that Malcolm needed at that moment. "Remember, son, your work will always speak louder than their words. Stay the course, Dad." Malcolm felt a surge of encouragement wash over him as he read the message. His father had been in his shoes once, facing the same biases, the same systemic barriers, and yet he had risen above it all to become the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the industry. If his father could do it, so could he. By the afternoon, Malcolm had made significant progress on the project, staying ahead of the pace he had set for himself. He was determined not to let the weight of the workload overwhelm him, even though Stephen's constant interruptions made it difficult to stay focused. Every couple of hours, Stephen would stroll by, peering over Malcolm's shoulder, making snide comments about how much work was left. "You're still not done with that?" Stephen asked as he passed by again, this time with a disapproving frown. "I thought you'd be further along by now." Malcolm didn't look up from his work. "I'm making good progress. I'll have it done before the deadline." Stephen raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "I hope so. Like I said, people like you don't get second chances." He walked away, leaving Malcolm with the now familiar sense of frustration gnawing at his gut. But Malcolm refused to let Stephen's words get to him. He kept his focus on the task at hand, knowing that the best way to prove himself was through his work. Stephen might think he had the upper hand now, but Malcolm knew that eventually the truth would come out, and when it did, it wouldn't be Malcolm standing on shaky ground. As the day came to a close, Malcolm finished the project and sent it off to Stephen for review. He had done everything he could to ensure that the work was flawless, meticulous, thorough, and completed ahead of schedule. He knew that Stephen would still find something to criticize, but at least Malcolm could rest knowing he had done his best. After everyone else had left the office, Malcolm stayed behind for a few extra minutes, gathering his things and mentally preparing for the next day. The long hours and constant pressure were exhausting, but Malcolm was used to hard work. He had learned from his father that nothing worth having ever came easy, and this internship was no different. As he locked up his desk and headed toward the elevator, Malcolm couldn't help but think about the conversations he had overheard earlier. The interns whispering about him, questioning his abilities, doubting his place at Horizon Enterprises. It all echoed Stephen's attitude toward him. But what they didn't know was that Malcolm wasn't just another intern struggling to prove himself. He was the CEO's son, and soon they would all realize that the man they had underestimated was someone they should have respected from the beginning. The morning sun peeked through the towering windows of Horizon Enterprises as Malcolm walked into the office, feeling more focused than ever. He had spent the night thinking about everything: Stephen's constant bullying, the snide remarks from his fellow interns, and the weight of the expectations placed on him simply because of who he was. But today, he had come to a decision. He wasn't going to let anyone at Horizon dictate how he felt about himself. He was here to succeed on his own terms, and nothing was going to stop him. As soon as he sat down at his desk, Malcolm noticed an email from Stephen waiting in his inbox. He clicked it open, expecting another barrage of criticism about the project he had completed the previous day. But what he saw was worse than he had anticipated. "Malcolm, I've reviewed your work and I'm disappointed. There are a number of issues that will need to be corrected. I'll expect you to stay late today to fix everything. Let's see if you can handle it. Stephen." Malcolm clenched his jaw as he reread the email. He had been meticulous in his work. He knew it was solid. But Stephen was clearly determined to make things as difficult as possible for him, regardless of the quality of the work. This wasn't about performance. It was about power. Just as Malcolm was about to respond, Stephen appeared at his desk, the same smug expression plastered across his face. "Got my email, I assume?" he said, not even waiting for a reply. "I hope you're ready to put in some extra hours. We can't afford any mistakes on this project, especially not from you." Malcolm took a deep breath before replying. "I'll take another look at the work, but I was thorough. The data is accurate." Stephen raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the interaction. "Oh, I'm sure you think it's accurate, but I'd prefer it if you went over everything again, just to be sure." His voice dripped with condescension, as if he were speaking to a child rather than a professional. Malcolm stared at Stephen for a moment, weighing his options. He wanted to argue, to point out that Stephen was intentionally undermining him, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Stephen had already made up his mind about who Malcolm was and what he was capable of. Trying to convince him otherwise would only waste time and energy. "I'll get it done," Malcolm said evenly, refusing to rise to Stephen's bait. Stephen's smirk widened. "Good. I'd hate for you to let everyone down. You know how it is. People like you can't afford to make mistakes." The comment hit Malcolm harder than he expected. It wasn't just the insult. It was the casual way Stephen dismissed him, as if his success or failure didn't matter, as if Malcolm's presence in the company was nothing more than a formality, something to be tolerated until he inevitably failed and was replaced by someone more deserving. But Malcolm didn't let the anger show. He nodded, returning his attention to his computer. "I'll take care of it." Stephen hovered for a moment longer, as if waiting for a reaction, before finally walking away. Once he was gone, Malcolm allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. He couldn't afford to lose his temper. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. For the rest of the morning, Malcolm went over the project again, double-checking every line of data and every report. As expected, the work was flawless. There were no mistakes, no issues that warranted staying late. But Malcolm knew that Stephen's game wasn't about finding actual errors. It was about testing Malcolm's resolve. While he worked, Malcolm kept thinking about the long term. He had been at Horizon Enterprises for only a few weeks, but the pressure was mounting. Stephen's constant bullying, the whispers from the interns, the subtle racism that hung in the air like a cloud. It was all part of the test. His father had told him once that corporate life wasn't just about the work. It was about navigating the politics, understanding who had real power and who just pretended to have it. As Malcolm focused on the data, he reminded himself that Stephen didn't hold any real power over him. Sure, Stephen was his immediate supervisor, but that didn't mean he was in control of Malcolm's future. There were people higher up, people who would eventually see Malcolm's work and recognize his talent, people who wouldn't care about his race or about the assumptions that came with it. Just after lunch, Brian, one of the interns, walked past Malcolm's cubicle and paused. "Hey, man," he said, leaning against the wall. "How's it going?" Malcolm glanced up, surprised by the sudden friendliness. "Good. Just working through this project." Brian nodded, his expression shifting slightly. "Yeah, I heard Stephen's been giving you a hard time. He's like that with all the new guys." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, unsure of how much of that statement was true. It was possible that Stephen was tough on all the interns, but Malcolm had a feeling that his situation was different. Still, he didn't want to stir up trouble. "It's fine. I'm managing." Brian shrugged. "Just keep your head down, you know? Stephen's a tough guy to impress, but if you get through this, you'll be fine." Some of the other interns had it rough at first, too. Malcolm forced a polite smile. "Yeah, thanks for the advice." Brian lingered for a moment longer, his eyes flicking toward the stack of papers on Malcolm's desk. "Anyway, good luck with that," he said before walking away, leaving Malcolm to wonder whether Brian's words were meant to be helpful or if they were just another reminder that he was the odd one out here. As the afternoon wore on, Malcolm found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since he started at Horizon Enterprises. The constant pressure, the scrutiny, the unspoken expectations, it all added up. But he knew that this was part of the journey. His father had faced the same struggles, and yet he had risen above it all to become the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the country. When Malcolm checked his phone later that afternoon, there was another message from his father. "It won't be easy, but it's worth it. Keep going." "Dad," Malcolm smiled as he read the words. His father always had a way of sending the right message at the right time. David Davis was a man of few words, but when he spoke, they carried weight. It was a reminder that Malcolm wasn't alone in this battle, that he had the strength and the support to get through whatever came his way. By the end of the day, Malcolm had gone through the project one more time and sent the updated version to Stephen. He knew that no matter how perfect it was, Stephen would find something to criticize, but Malcolm wasn't going to let that bother him. His work spoke for itself, and that was all that mattered. As he packed up his things and headed for the elevator, Malcolm couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over him. He had done his best, and that was all anyone could ask for. The rest would take care of itself. Little did he know the time for Stephen's downfall was fast approaching. The truth about who Malcolm really was, about his connection to the CEO, was about to come out. And when it did, Stephen would realize that the man he had been belittling and undermining was far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the office with a renewed sense of determination. He knew that Stephen's constant bullying wasn't going to stop anytime soon, but he also knew that the tide was about to turn. The truth was nearing the surface, and Malcolm could feel the weight of anticipation hanging in the air. He wasn't the only one preparing for something big. His father, David Davis, had hinted that the time was coming when everything would be revealed. As soon as Malcolm sat down at his desk, he noticed another email from Stephen waiting in his inbox. He braced himself for more unnecessary criticism, but this time the tone of the email was more pointed than usual. "Malcolm, it's become clear to me that you're struggling to keep up with the demands of this position. I'll need to see some significant improvement if you want to last here. We don't have time to handhold, and I'm not here to cover for your mistakes. Stephen, Malcolm clenched his fists under the desk, forcing himself to stay calm. There were no mistakes. He had checked his work thoroughly, and he knew that he had done everything right. This wasn't about his performance. It was about Stephen trying to undermine him, to make him feel like he didn't belong. But Malcolm had faced worse before, and he wasn't going to let this break him. Before he could respond to the email, Stephen appeared at his cubicle, as if perfectly timed to catch Malcolm off guard. "Got my message, I assume?" Stephen said, his tone sharp and condescending. "I did," Malcolm replied, keeping his voice steady. "But I don't believe there's been any issue with my work. I've reviewed everything carefully." Stephen's smirk widened, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "Oh, I'm sure you think it's fine. But here at Horizon, we have high standards. Maybe you're just not cut out for it." Malcolm met Stephen's gaze, refusing to back down. "I've met the standards, and I'll continue to do so." Stephen chuckled darkly, leaning in slightly. "You're confident, I'll give you that. But confidence doesn't keep you employed here. Results do. And from what I've seen, you're barely hanging on." Malcolm's pulse quickened, but he remained composed. "I'll keep doing my best." Stephen raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting Malcolm to stand his ground so calmly. "We'll see," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But don't get too comfortable. People like you don't last long in this world." The comment hung in the air, loaded with all the prejudice and disdain that Stephen had barely been concealing since Malcolm's first day. But Malcolm wasn't shaken. He had heard these kinds of remarks before, and he had survived them all. After Stephen finally walked away, Malcolm took a deep breath and refocused on his work. The temptation to argue, to push back against Stephen's blatant racism, was strong, but Malcolm knew that now wasn't the time. He had a bigger plan, and soon Stephen would be the one answering for his actions. Later that afternoon, Malcolm received another email from his father, David Davis. This time, it wasn't just words of encouragement. It was a sign that the moment was approaching. "Be ready, Malcolm. The board meeting is in 2 days. Things are about to change." "Dad," Malcolm's heart raced as he read the message. The board meeting, the one where everything would be revealed. His father had been planning this for weeks, watching from the sidelines as Stephen's behavior grew worse and worse. Now it seemed that the time for patience was over. Malcolm was ready. The rest of the day passed in a blur, with Malcolm completing his assignments while mentally preparing for what was to come. Stephen had no idea what was about to hit him. For weeks he had bullied Malcolm, undermined his work, and belittled him in front of the other interns. All while assuming that Malcolm was powerless to fight back. But the truth was far more complicated than Stephen knew. As the office began to empty out for the day, Malcolm stayed behind to finish a few final tasks. He was deep in thought when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see Stephen standing there, his expression unreadable. "I heard you've been working late, a lot recently," Stephen said, his tone strangely casual. "Trying to keep up, I assume." Malcolm nodded, keeping his response brief. "Just finishing up some work." Stephen crossed his arms, eyeing Malcolm with what almost seemed like curiosity. "You know, it's funny, you're putting in all this effort, but I'm not sure you really understand what it takes to succeed here. Horizon isn't like other places. We don't hand out participation trophies. You either make it or you don't." Malcolm stared at him, his pulse steady. "I'm aware." Stephen's smirk returned, more pronounced than ever. "I don't think you are. You see, guys like you, guys who get in because of quotas, because of who they know, they don't last. They don't have the grit. And I can tell you right now, Malcolm, you don't have it." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he refused to rise to Stephen's bait. "I guess we'll see." Stephen chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, we will." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Malcolm alone once again. But this time, Malcolm wasn't angry. He wasn't frustrated. He was ready. As Malcolm left the office that night, his mind was focused on the upcoming board meeting. His father had told him to be ready, and Malcolm knew that the moment was fast approaching when Stephen's reign of arrogance and prejudice would come crashing down. The next morning, as Malcolm entered the office, there was a buzz of anticipation in the air. The board meeting was only a day away, and everyone seemed on edge. Stephen, however, appeared more confident than ever. He strutted through the office with his usual swagger, completely unaware of what was coming. But Malcolm knew that soon Stephen's confidence would be shattered. The truth about Malcolm's identity and his connection to the CEO was about to be revealed. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the tension in the office was palpable. Horizon Enterprises had never felt more charged with anticipation. For Malcolm, this day marked a turning point, one he had been preparing for, even if Stephen and the other interns remained blissfully unaware. The plan that his father, David Davis had carefully set into motion was about to reach its culmination. And when the dust settled, everything would be different. As Malcolm sat at his desk, going through the motions of his morning tasks, he couldn't help but glance at the conference room at the far end of the office floor. The glass walls offered a clear view of the executives gathering for the meeting, each of them dressed in sharp suits, carrying the weight of the company's future on their shoulders. Among them was David Davis, the man behind it all, standing tall and composed as he greeted the board members. Stephen, of course, was in rare form that morning. He had been strutting around the office all day, boasting about his upcoming promotion to anyone who would listen. He hadn't said it outright, but everyone knew that Stephen expected to walk out of that boardroom with a higher title, more authority, and a bigger paycheck. What Stephen didn't know was that this meeting wasn't going to go the way he thought. As the clock ticked closer to the start of the board meeting, Stephen approached Malcolm's desk with a smug grin. "Big day today," he said, folding his arms as he looked down at Malcolm. "You nervous?" Malcolm glanced up, his expression calm. "Not at all." Stephen chuckled, shaking his head. "I would be if I were you. Days like this, they make or break careers. And from where I'm standing, you're looking pretty breakable." Malcolm didn't bother responding. He knew that Stephen was fishing for a reaction, hoping to see some sign of weakness or fear. But Malcolm wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. He had played this game long enough, and now it was time to win. "You know," Stephen continued, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret, "I've been thinking a lot about you, about how you ended up here. And I've come to a conclusion. You're not going to make it. Guys like you don't have what it takes to survive in this world. You might think you're smart, but this place isn't built for people like you. You're out of your league." Malcolm met Stephen's gaze evenly, refusing to be rattled by his words. "I guess we'll see." Stephen sneered, clearly irritated by Malcolm's calm demeanor. "Yeah, we will." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, heading toward the conference room where the board meeting was about to begin. Malcolm watched him go, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. This was it. Everything he had been working toward, everything his father had been preparing, was about to unfold. He knew that by the end of this day, the entire dynamic at Horizon Enterprises would shift, and Stephen would be left standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. As the meeting began, Malcolm continued working, trying to keep his mind occupied even as his thoughts raced ahead to what was happening behind those glass walls. He could picture the scene in his mind, Stephen, sitting at the table, full of false confidence as he made his pitch for the promotion he believed he deserved. And then, at just the right moment, his father would step in, revealing the truth that Stephen had been blind to all along. After what felt like hours, but was really only a little over an hour, the door to the conference room finally opened. The board members filed out one by one, their expressions neutral and unreadable. Stephen followed shortly after, his face still fixed in that same smug grin. He gave Malcolm a brief glance as he passed, but there was something different about his expression, a hint of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Malcolm's heart raced. The reveal was coming. Not long after the meeting ended, Malcolm received a message on his phone from his father. "Come to my office. It's Tim." Malcolm stood, taking a deep breath before heading toward his father's office on the top floor. As he made his way through the halls, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, but he ignored them. This moment wasn't about them. This was about setting the record straight. When Malcolm entered his father's office, David Davis was standing by the window, his back turned as he looked out over the city skyline. The weight of his presence filled the room, and for a moment Malcolm hesitated, taking in the gravity of what was about to happen. "Dad," Malcolm said quietly, closing the door behind him. David turned, a small but proud smile on his face. "It's done," he said simply. Malcolm exhaled, the tension finally leaving his body. He knew what his father meant. Stephen's reign of arrogance was over. David walked over to him, placing a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "I've made it clear to the board who you really are," he said, his voice firm. "And I have also made it clear that Stephen's behavior has no place in this company." Malcolm nodded, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift from his shoulders. "What happens now?" David's expression hardened slightly. "Stephen will be dealt with. He has no idea what's coming, but he'll find out soon enough. I've gathered all the evidence we need to show the board just how unfit he is for any kind of leadership role. He'll be lucky to keep his job, let alone get a promotion." Malcolm felt a sense of satisfaction rise within him. This was the justice he had been waiting for, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been belittled or bullied by someone like Stephen. "And me?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady. David's smile returned. You've proven yourself, son. The board knows who you are now, and they know what you're capable of. You've earned your place here, not because of your last name, but because of your work. Malcolm smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. Thank you. David's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, Malcolm saw the man behind the CEO, the father who had always believed in him, even when the world didn't. You've done well, Malcolm. I'm proud of you. Malcolm nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. I couldn't have done it without you. David placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression serious. This is just the beginning. You've proven you can survive in this world, but now it's time to thrive. Stephen was just a test. There will be more challenges ahead, but I have no doubt you'll rise to meet them. Malcolm stood a little taller, feeling the weight of his father's words settle over him. He had survived the test, but now it was time to rise. As Malcolm left his father's office, he knew that the next few days would be critical. Stephen had no idea what was coming, but soon the truth would hit him like a freight train. Everything was about to change. The next morning, the atmosphere at Horizon Enterprises was different. Something had shifted, and Malcolm could feel it as soon as he walked through the doors. The usual buzz of office chatter seemed muted, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Malcolm knew that today was the day when Stephen's world would come crashing down. As Malcolm made his way to his desk, he couldn't help but notice the way people looked at him, some with curiosity, others with quiet respect. Word had begun to spread, though no one seemed to know the full story yet. But it wouldn't be long before everyone knew exactly who Malcolm was and why he wasn't just another intern. Stephen, however, was oblivious. He strutted through the office with the same arrogant confidence he always had, unaware that his time was running out. He was on the phone when he passed Malcolm's cubicle, too engrossed in whatever deal he was working on to pay much attention to the world around him. Malcolm sat down at his desk and pulled up his emails. The first message he saw was from his father. David Davis, it's happening today. Be ready. Dad. Malcolm's heart raced as he read the message. This was it, the moment of reckoning. He had been patient, endured Stephen's bullying and constant undermining, but now it was time for the truth to come out. Stephen would finally face the consequences of his actions, and Malcolm would no longer have to hide who he really was. As the morning wore on, Malcolm stayed focused on his work, though his mind kept drifting to what was about to unfold. He had always known that this moment would come, but now that it was here, the anticipation was almost overwhelming. How would Stephen react? Would he try to fight back, or would he crumble under the weight of his own arrogance? Around mid-morning, Malcolm received a message from one of the executive assistants asking him to come to the conference room. His pulse quickened as he gathered his things and headed toward the room. This was the moment. When Malcolm entered the conference room, he found his father, David, already there, standing at the head of the long table. His expression was calm, but there was a firmness in his eyes that Malcolm recognized. David wasn't just here as a CEO, he was here as a father, ready to stand by his son and set things right. Malcolm, have a seat, David said, gesturing to the chair beside him. Malcolm sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. The tension in the room was thick, but he knew that this was the culmination of everything he had been working toward. Not long after, the door opened again and Stephen walked in, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He was smiling, clearly expecting this to be the moment when his promotion would be announced. Morning, Mr. Davis, Stephen said, flashing his usual confident grin as he sat down across from Malcolm. David remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Stephen. Then finally, he spoke. Stephen, we need to have a serious conversation. Stephen's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Of course, I assume this is about the promotion? David's expression remained unreadable. No, this is about something far more important than any promotion. Malcolm watched as confusion flickered across Stephen's face. He clearly wasn't expecting this, and the uncertainty was beginning to show. David continued, his voice calm but firm. Over the past few weeks, I've been made aware of certain behaviors within this company, behaviors that go against everything we stand for. Specifically, your behavior toward one of our interns. Stephen's eyes darted to Malcolm, and then back to David. I don't understand. What are you talking about? David leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Stephen. I'm talking about the way you've treated Malcolm, the way you've undermined him, belittled him, and assumed that he didn't belong here. I've seen the way you've tried to break him down, and I've heard every word you've said. Stephen's face went pale. Mr. Davis, I can explain. David held up a hand, cutting him off. There's nothing to explain, Stephen. Your actions speak for themselves. And there's one more thing you should know. Malcolm's heart raced as he watched his father speak the words he had been waiting to hear for weeks. Malcolm isn't just an intern, David said, his voice steady and commanding. He's my son. The room went silent. For a moment, Stephen just stared at David, his mouth slightly open in shock. Then, slowly, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Your son? Stephen stammered, his voice barely a whisper. David nodded. Yes, my son. The man you've spent weeks bullying and belittling, thinking he was just another intern you could push around. But now you know the truth. Stephen's face flushed with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time since Malcolm had met him, Stephen was speechless. David continued, his voice sharp. You've shown nothing but arrogance and prejudice. Stephen, you've disrespected not just my son, but the values of this company, and there are consequences for that. Stephen's hands trembled slightly as he looked between David and Malcolm, his mind clearly racing for a way out. Mr. Davis, I didn't know. If I had known, it shouldn't have mattered, David said, his voice cold. It shouldn't matter whether he's my son or not. No one should be treated the way you treated Malcolm. You've let your bias and your ego dictate your actions, and now you're going to face the consequences. Malcolm sat quietly, watching as the man who had tormented him for weeks was finally brought to his knees. Stephen's confidence, the smugness that had defined him, was gone. All that was left was a man desperate to save himself from the fallout of his own actions. Please, Mr. Davis, Stephen pleaded, his voice cracking. I didn't mean... David cut him off with a sharp look. You're done here, Stephen. Pack up your things. You're no longer part of Horizon Enterprises. The finality of David's words hung in the air, and Malcolm could see the moment when it hit Stephen. The man who had walked into the room with all the confidence in the world now sat slumped in his chair, defeated. Without another word, Stephen stood, his face pale and his hands shaking. He cast one last glance at Malcolm, a mixture of anger and regret in his eyes, before turning and walking out of the conference room. His time at Horizon was over. Malcolm exhaled, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting from his shoulders. It was over. Stephen was gone. David turned to his son, his expression softening. You handled yourself well, Malcolm. I'm proud of you. Malcolm smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief and pride. Thank you, Dad. David stood, placing a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. This was just the beginning. There's a lot more ahead for you, but you've proven you can handle it. Malcolm nodded, knowing that his father was right. He had survived the worst of it, and now the path ahead was clear. The day after Stephen's dismissal felt different, lighter, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from the entire office. Malcolm walked through the doors of Horizon Enterprises with a new sense of freedom, knowing that the toxic presence of Stephen was gone for good. There were no more condescending remarks, no more subtle jabs designed to tear him down. For the first time, Malcolm felt like he could breathe. As he sat down at his desk, Malcolm noticed that several of his colleagues were casting glances his way, though none of them said anything outright. He knew that word had spread quickly about what had happened. While the details might not have been clear to everyone yet, it was obvious that Stephen's sudden departure had sent shockwaves through the company. By mid-morning, Brian, one of the interns who had been friendly with Stephen, cautiously approached Malcolm's desk. His usual swagger seemed diminished, and there was a nervous energy about him. Hey, man, Brian said, his voice quieter than usual. I heard what happened with Stephen. Malcolm nodded, keeping his response neutral. Yeah, it was long overdue. Brian shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to navigate the conversation. I didn't know you were, connected like that. The CEO's son and all. Malcolm glanced up at him, recognizing the awkwardness in Brian's tone. It was the same discomfort he had seen before, from people who didn't know how to handle the fact that Malcolm was more than they had assumed. But Malcolm wasn't here for their approval. He had earned his place, and that was all that mattered. Yeah, Malcolm said simply, not offering any more explanation. Brian hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Well, if you ever need anything, just let me know. Malcolm smiled politely, though he knew Brian's offer was more about saving face than genuine camaraderie. Thanks, Brian. I'll keep that in mind. As Brian walked away, Malcolm couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The power dynamics in the office had shifted, and while some people were scrambling to adjust, Malcolm was finally standing on solid ground. Later that afternoon, Malcolm received another message from his father. David Davis, proud of how you handled yourself. The team is starting to see what you're made of. Keep going. Dad. Malcolm smiled as he read the words. His father had always been supportive, but in his own way, quiet, reserved, never overbearing. And now, after everything that had happened with Stephen, Malcolm knew that his father's respect for him had only grown. This was about more than being the CEO's son. It was about proving that he could rise to the challenges on his own terms. As the day wound down, Malcolm received a calendar invite from his father's assistant, a one-on-one meeting with David in his office the next morning. Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. While he had always been in contact with his father, official meetings at work were rare. This had to be about something important. The next morning, Malcolm made his way up to the executive floor, where his father's office was located. The air seemed different here, quieter, more focused. As he approached the door to his father's office, the assistant gave him a polite nod before opening the door. "Go on in, Malcolm. He's expecting you." Malcolm stepped into the spacious office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. His father stood by the window, deep in thought, but when he heard Malcolm enter, he turned and smiled warmly. "Malcolm, good to see you," David said, motioning for him to sit. Malcolm took a seat, feeling a sense of anticipation. Whatever this meeting was about, he knew it would mark a new chapter in his time at Horizon Enterprises. David sat across from him, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to talk to you about the next steps. You've handled yourself well through everything with Stephen. You stayed focused, you didn't let him get to you, and now the team sees what you are capable of. That's important." Malcolm nodded, listening intently. "Thank you. I tried to keep my head down and let the work speak for itself." David's eyes softened with pride. "And it did. That's why I think it's time to talk about your future here." Malcolm's heart raced. He had been waiting for this conversation, though he hadn't been sure when it would come. Now that it was happening, he felt a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "I've been watching you closely, Malcolm," David continued, his tone serious. "Not just as a father, but as the CEO, you have the potential to do great things here. But potential only goes so far. You need experience, challenges that will push you beyond your comfort zone. And that's what I want to discuss." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, eager to hear what his father had in mind. "What do you mean?" David smiled, though there was a hint of gravity in his expression. "I want to put you on a project, something high profile, something that will allow you to really prove yourself to the team, to the board, and to me. You've earned that chance." Malcolm's mind raced. A high-profile project? This was the kind of opportunity that could make or break his career at Horizon. It was exactly what he had been working toward. But now that the moment had arrived, the pressure felt immense. "I'll take it," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. "Whatever the project is, I'm ready." David nodded, clearly pleased with Malcolm's response. "Good, I knew you would be. This is a big responsibility, Malcolm. It's not just about doing the work. It's about leading a team, making decisions, and proving that you are capable of more than just getting by." Malcolm felt a surge of determination. This was his chance to show not just his father, but the entire company, that he was ready for something bigger. He wasn't just the CEO's son, coasting on a family name. He was Malcolm Davis, a man who had earned his place through hard work and perseverance. "What's the project?" Malcolm asked, eager to dive into the details. David smiled. "You'll find out soon enough. I'm pulling together the team now, and you'll be hearing from me in the next couple of days. But for now, I wanted to make sure you were prepared, mentally, emotionally, for what's coming." Malcolm nodded. "I'm ready." David stood and walked around the desk, placing a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son. You've come a long way. But remember, this is just the beginning. You've proven you can survive the pressure, but now it's time to thrive. Don't let anything hold you back." Malcolm stood, meeting his father's gaze. "I won't. I'm ready to take this on." David smiled, his pride evident. "Good, because I have no doubt you'll succeed." As Malcolm left his father's office, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. And now, without the weight of Stephen's constant bullying hanging over him, Malcolm could finally focus on what truly mattered: his work, his growth, and his future at Horizon Enterprises. Back at his desk, Malcolm sat down and opened his laptop, preparing for the day ahead. The office was already buzzing with activity, and as Malcolm looked around, he realized that the whispers and doubts that had once filled the air had disappeared. He had earned his place here, and now it was time to prove it. The following days at Horizon Enterprises passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Malcolm knew that the high-profile project his father had mentioned was on the horizon, but the details remained elusive. He felt both excitement and pressure. This project could define his role at the company, and he was determined to exceed every expectation. One morning, as Malcolm was going through his emails, a message popped up from his father's executive assistant. "Amanda, Malcolm, the project brief is ready. Please report to the main conference room at 10 a.m. The team has been assembled, and David will be presenting the details. Amanda. Malcolm's heart raced. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He quickly gathered his things, double-checking his notes, before heading to the conference room. As he entered the room, he saw several familiar faces, senior managers, department heads, and key players in the company's leadership. At the head of the table stood his father, David Davis, exuding calm authority as always. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that this project was something significant. "Thank you all for coming," David began, his voice steady and commanding. "What we're about to discuss is a crucial initiative for the future of Horizon Enterprises. This project will determine our position in the market over the next few years, and I need the best of the best to ensure its success." David's eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on Malcolm. It was a subtle gesture, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Malcolm felt the weight of his father's expectations, but he also felt a surge of determination. He was ready for this. "The project we'll be working on is a complete overhaul of our digital infrastructure," David continued. "As you know, the landscape of corporate technology is changing rapidly, and we need to stay ahead of the curve. This project will involve the integration of cutting-edge digital solutions, streamlining our operations, and ensuring that Horizon Enterprises remains at the forefront of innovation." Malcolm listened intently, his mind already racing with ideas. This was exactly the kind of challenge he had been hoping for. A project that would push him to his limits, requiring both strategic thinking and technical expertise. It wasn't just a test of his abilities, it was an opportunity to lead. David went on to explain the various components of the project, from the technical requirements to the timeline and expected outcomes. As he spoke, Malcolm's confidence grew. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, dealing with Stephen's constant undermining, proving his worth despite the challenges, and now he was being given the chance to prove himself on a much larger stage. "And now to the leadership of this project," David said, glancing once again in Malcolm's direction. "I've thought long and hard about who should lead this initiative. It's not just about technical knowledge or management experience. It's about vision, perseverance, and the ability to handle pressure. And that's why I'm assigning this project to Malcolm." The room went silent for a moment as all eyes turned to Malcolm. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but the weight of the responsibility hit him all at once. He knew that being named the leader of such a critical project wasn't just a vote of confidence from his father. It was a test of everything he had learned and endured since joining Horizon. David's voice broke the silence. "Malcolm has proven himself capable of handling the pressures of this company, and I have no doubt that he's ready for this challenge. I expect nothing less than excellence from him and from all of you as we move forward." Malcolm stood, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you, Mr. Davis." He corrected himself quickly, feeling the eyes of his colleagues on him. "I'm honored to lead this project, and I'll make sure we deliver the best results possible." David gave a small, approving nod, and with that, the meeting continued with more in-depth discussions about the project's logistics and next steps. Malcolm's mind was buzzing with possibilities, but he kept himself grounded, knowing that the real work was just beginning. Later that afternoon, after the meeting had ended, Malcolm returned to his desk, still absorbing everything that had happened. He had been given a monumental task, one that would require not only his skills, but also his ability to lead a team of experienced professionals. He knew that some people in the company would question his ability to take on such a role, especially given his age and relative inexperience. But Malcolm wasn't focused on what others thought. He was focused on success. Just as he was about to dive into the project plans, Brian, one of the interns, approached his desk again, this time with a more serious expression than usual. "Hey, Malcolm," Brian began, leaning against the cubicle wall. "I heard you got put in charge of the big project. That's a huge deal, man." Malcolm nodded, sensing there was more to Brian's words. "Yeah, it's a big opportunity." Brian shifted awkwardly, clearly searching for the right words. "I just wanted to say, I guess I didn't realize who you were when you started. I knew you were smart, but I didn't get why you were so focused. Now it makes sense. You've got big shoes to fill." Malcolm gave a small smile. "It's not about my dad. This project, it's on me. I have to prove myself just like anyone else." Brian nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I get that. It's just, well, some people are going to see you differently now. Not just because of the project, but because of, the whole Stephen thing." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" Brian hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, everyone knows what happened with Stephen, and now that you're running this big project, then some people are going to think you only got it because of your dad. They won't say it to your face, but trust me, they're talking about it. Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly. He had known that this kind of talk was inevitable, but hearing it still stung. No matter what he did, there would always be people who assumed he hadn't earned his success, that it had been handed to him because of his father's influence. But Malcolm wasn't going to let that stop him. "I appreciate you telling me," Malcolm said, keeping his tone even, "but I'm not worried about what people think. I'm here to do the work, and the results will speak for themselves." Brian nodded, a look of respect crossing his face. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that. Just wanted to give you a heads up." Malcolm smiled, grateful for the gesture. "Thanks, Brian. I'll keep that in mind." As Brian walked away, Malcolm returned his attention to the project plan. He knew that proving himself wouldn't be easy, especially with the whispers and doubts swirling around him. But that was just another challenge to overcome. And if there was one thing Malcolm had learned, it was how to thrive under pressure. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Malcolm dove headfirst into the project, meeting with department heads, gathering data, and assembling his team. Every detail had to be perfect. There was no room for error. He knew that all eyes were on him, waiting to see if he would rise to the challenge or crack under the weight of expectations. But Malcolm didn't falter. He had come too far to back down now. Malcolm knew that leading a high-profile project would be no small feat, and as the days passed, he found himself immersed in the complexity of the task. Every morning he arrived early, poring over the data, organizing meetings, and ensuring that every detail was accounted for. He was determined not to let anything slip through the cracks. His team, a mix of seasoned veterans and newer employees, was starting to come together. Malcolm made it a point to meet with each team member individually, making sure they knew exactly what was expected of them and offering support where needed. Though some of the more experienced members seemed hesitant at first, it didn't take long for them to realize that Malcolm wasn't just coasting on his father's name. He was here to work and work hard. One afternoon, Malcolm sat in a strategy meeting with key team members from IT, operations, and finance. The room was buzzing with discussion as they reviewed the first phase of the digital overhaul project. Malcolm had been taking notes, absorbing as much as he could from each department's perspective. When Carla, the head of IT, spoke up. "Malcolm," she began, adjusting her glasses as she looked across the table. "I've been thinking about the timeline we've laid out for this phase. I know it's ambitious, but there are some logistical hurdles that might slow us down. I'm concerned about hitting our milestones without compromising quality." Malcolm leaned forward, considering her words carefully. Carla was one of the most respected department heads in the company, and her opinion carried weight. "I appreciate you bringing that up, Carla," he said. "Let's break it down. What specific hurdles are you seeing?" Carla glanced at her notes before responding. "The integration of the new digital infrastructure with our existing systems is going to be more complicated than we initially thought. We're talking about legacy systems that haven't been updated in years, and transitioning without causing disruptions to operations is going to require more time than we've allocated." Malcolm nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. This project was critical to the company's future, but rushing through it could lead to mistakes that would be costly in the long run. He wanted to find a balance between hitting deadlines and ensuring the quality of the work. "That makes sense. Let's look at adjusting the timeline for this phase. I'd rather we do it right than rush through and have to fix things later." The other team members exchanged glances, clearly impressed with Malcolm's willingness to listen and adapt. It was a small moment, but it solidified Malcolm's role as a leader in their eyes. He wasn't here to micromanage or impose unrealistic expectations. He was here to collaborate and make sure the project succeeded. As the meeting continued, Malcolm took note of each department's concerns, making adjustments where necessary. By the end of the session, they had reworked the timeline to account for the additional challenges, and everyone left the room feeling confident about the direction of the project. But Malcolm knew the hardest part was yet to come. That evening, as Malcolm sat at his desk, going over the revised project plan, he received a message from his father, David. "I heard from Carla that you made some adjustments to the timeline. Good call. Let's talk tomorrow about how you're handling everything." "Dad," Malcolm smiled, feeling a sense of pride. His father's approval meant a lot, but more than that, he was proud of how he had navigated the situation. This project was testing him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he was rising to the challenge. He was no longer just the CEO's son. He was Malcolm Davis, leading a team and making critical decisions that would impact the future of Horizon Enterprises. The next day, Malcolm arrived at his father's office for their scheduled meeting. David was already at his desk, reviewing documents, but he looked up and smiled when Malcolm entered. "Morning, Malcolm. Have a seat." Malcolm sat down, feeling a mixture of anticipation and confidence. He knew that his father wouldn't sugarcoat anything, If there were concerns about how he was handling the project, David would bring them up. David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've been hearing good things about how you're managing the project," he said. "Carla's impressed, and that's not easy to do. You've shown that you're willing to listen and adapt when necessary. That's a key part of leadership." Malcolm nodded, grateful for the feedback. "I just want to make sure we're doing this right. It's a big project, and I don't want us to cut corners." David smiled. "That's exactly the mindset you need. But I want to talk to you about something else, something that goes beyond just managing the team." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" David's expression grew more serious. "You're doing a great job leading the project, but leadership isn't just about managing tasks. It's about navigating relationships, handling the pressure, and making tough decisions when things go wrong. And they will go wrong at some point. How you handle those moments will define your success here." Malcolm took a deep breath, processing his father's words. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing it spelled out so plainly was sobering. "I understand. I'll be ready." David nodded, clearly satisfied with Malcolm's response. "Good. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you because I believe in you. You've proven that you have what it takes to lead, but now you need to be prepared for the challenges that come with that responsibility." Malcolm sat up a little straighter, feeling the weight of his father's expectations. "I appreciate that, Dad. I know this project is critical, and I won't let you down." David stood, walking around the desk to place a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "You won't. I have no doubt about that. Just remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about handling the imperfections with grace and resilience." Malcolm nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let anything stop him now. Over the next few weeks, Malcolm and his team made significant progress on the project. The adjustments to the timeline had allowed them to move forward without rushing, and the team had begun to gel under Malcolm's leadership. There were challenges, of course, but Malcolm handled each one with the steady composure his father had taught him. One afternoon, as Malcolm was finalizing a report, Carla stopped by his desk. "Hey, Malcolm," she said, a rare smile on her face. "I just wanted to say you're doing a great job. I've been in this company a long time, and I've seen a lot of managers come and go, but you've got something different. You're handling this project like a pro." Malcolm smiled, grateful for the compliment. "Thanks, Carla. That means a lot coming from you." Carla nodded, her expression sincere. "Just keep doing what you're doing. You've got the team behind you." As Carla walked away, Malcolm felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the work itself. He had earned the respect of his team, and that was something no one could take away from him. But as Malcolm continued to lead the project, he knew that the real test was still ahead. There would be setbacks, challenges that would push him to his limits, and moments when doubt crept in. But with his father's support and the confidence he had built in himself, Malcolm was ready to face whatever came next. As the project advanced, Malcolm faced increasingly complex challenges. The pressure to deliver on time while maintaining the highest standards weighed heavily on him, but he stayed focused, determined to push through. The team was now in full swing, with each department moving forward under Malcolm's guidance, and progress was steady. Yet Malcolm knew that the hardest part was still ahead, the final stretch, where everything would be tested. One morning, as Malcolm reviewed the latest updates from the IT and operations teams, he noticed a potential problem, a significant bottleneck in one of the system integrations. The IT team had flagged the issue, but hadn't provided a solution yet. It was a critical flaw that, if left unresolved, could delay the entire project. Malcolm immediately scheduled a meeting with Carla, the head of IT, and the lead engineers to discuss the issue. They gathered in the conference room, the tension palpable as they began to address the problem. "This bottleneck could set us back at least 2 weeks, Carla said, her tone serious as she looked over the data on her tablet. "We've tried a few workarounds, but none of them are stable enough for a system this large." Malcolm nodded, his mind racing as he considered the implications. A 2-week delay could throw off their entire schedule, potentially jeopardizing the project's success. But Malcolm wasn't willing to accept defeat. "There has to be another way," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "What are we missing?" The room was quiet for a moment as everyone thought over the problem. One of the engineers, Troy, finally spoke up. "Well, we could look at streamlining some of the non-essential processes during the integration. It's risky, but if we can reduce the load on the system, it might be enough to get us through without causing a major delay." Carla raised an eyebrow. "That's a big risk, Troy. If we streamline too much, we could end up cutting critical functions." Malcolm considered their options, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. He knew that taking shortcuts wasn't the answer, but he also understood the need to adapt in the face of challenges. They couldn't afford to let this issue derail the project, but they couldn't compromise the quality of their work either. "Let's explore it," Malcolm said finally, his tone decisive. "Troy, I want you and your team to run a full analysis on streamlining the non-essential processes. See if we can do it without jeopardizing the integrity of the system. Carla, keep me updated on every step. We'll make adjustments if needed, but we can't afford a 2-week delay." The team nodded, and with that, the meeting ended. Malcolm knew the decision he had made carried risks, but he was confident in his team's ability to find a solution. The stakes were high, but so was his determination to see the project succeed. As the days passed, Malcolm kept a close eye on the progress of the IT team's analysis. Troy and his engineers worked tirelessly, running simulations and stress tests to find the right balance between efficiency and stability. Malcolm was in constant communication with Carla, ensuring that every decision was backed by data and that no one was cutting corners. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Malcolm received a call from his father. "Malcolm," David's voice came through the phone, calm as ever. "I heard about the bottleneck. How are you handling it?" Malcolm exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "We're working on it. It's not easy, but Troy and Carla have a plan. We're looking at streamlining some of the processes to avoid a delay." There was a pause on the other end of the line before David responded. "Good. You're handling this well. Just remember, don't let the pressure force you into making hasty decisions. Sometimes taking a step back gives you the clarity you need." Malcolm nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. David's advice was always timely, and Malcolm appreciated the reminder. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Dad." "Anytime. You've got this, Malcolm. Keep going." The call ended, and Malcolm sat for a moment, reflecting on his father's words. He was under immense pressure, but he had to stay focused, clear-headed, and decisive. He had come too far to let the weight of the situation overwhelm him. By the end of the week, the IT team had completed their analysis. Troy and Carla presented the results to Malcolm in a detailed report, outlining the adjustments they had made to the system integration. It was a calculated risk, but the simulations showed that the streamlined processes would hold up under the load, allowing them to move forward without a delay. Malcolm felt a surge of relief as he reviewed the data. "This looks good," he said, his voice steady. "Let's move ahead with it, but I want constant monitoring. If anything starts to go wrong, we need to catch it early." Carla nodded. "We'll keep a close eye on it. If anything shifts, you'll be the first to know." Malcolm smiled, feeling a sense of pride in his team. They had risen to the challenge, and together they had found a way to keep the project on track without sacrificing quality. It was a victory, but Malcolm knew that there were still hurdles ahead. The project was far from over, and every phase brought new challenges. A few days later, Malcolm was in his office when Amanda, his father's executive assistant, knocked on his door. "Malcolm, your father would like to see you in his office," she said, her tone professional but warm. Malcolm nodded, closing his laptop and following Amanda to the executive floor. When he arrived at his father's office, David was standing by the window, as he often did, looking out at the city skyline. He turned when Malcolm entered, a small smile on his face. "Malcolm, come in. Have a seat." Malcolm sat down, wondering what this meeting was about. His father had been keeping a close eye on the project, but this felt different, more personal. David sat across from him, his expression serious but kind. "I wanted to talk to you about something that goes beyond this project." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" David leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "You've done an incredible job so far, Malcolm. You've led your team through challenges, made tough decisions, and proven that you're capable of handling pressure. But there's more to leadership than just managing a project. It's about vision, about where you want to take things next." Malcolm listened intently, knowing that his father was preparing him for something bigger. "What do you mean?" David's smile returned, though it was softer this time. "I've been thinking about the future of Horizon Enterprises. This project is just the beginning of what I see for the company. We're heading into a new era of innovation, and I want you to be a key part of that." Malcolm's heart raced as he processed his father's words. This was more than just a project. His father was talking about the future of the company, about Malcolm's role in shaping that future. David continued, his tone serious. "Once this project is completed, I want you to take on more responsibilities, not just with the digital infrastructure, but with the company as a whole. I see you as part of the next generation of leadership here, and I want to start preparing you for that." Malcolm sat back, the weight of his father's words sinking in. This was bigger than he had imagined. He had always known that his father expected him to be involved in the company, but now it was clear that David had much larger plans for him. "I'm ready," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Whatever comes next, I'm ready. David smiled, pride evident in his eyes. I know you are, and when the time comes, I have no doubt you'll lead this company into the future. The realization that his father was preparing him for a much larger role at Horizon Enterprises filled Malcolm with both excitement and a profound sense of responsibility. The digital infrastructure project was important, but the idea of stepping into a leadership role that would shape the entire company's future was daunting. Still, Malcolm knew he couldn't back down. He had earned his place, and now he needed to prove that he could handle whatever came next. As the project progressed, the team began tackling the final phases of the infrastructure overhaul. The streamlined processes implemented by Troy and Carla had been holding up well, and they had managed to avoid the delays that could have thrown the entire timeline off track. Malcolm's decision to trust his team's analysis had paid off, and the project was nearing completion. But just as things seemed to be running smoothly, a new challenge arose. One afternoon, Malcolm received an urgent email from Carla. The subject line read, "Critical issue, immediate attention needed." His heart sank as he opened the email and saw the details. One of the key systems in the integration had started to fail during the stress tests, causing unexpected errors that could potentially compromise the entire project if not addressed immediately. Malcolm wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting with Carla, Troy, and the other key members of the IT team. They gathered in the conference room, their faces tense as they began reviewing the issue. "What's going on, Carla?" Malcolm asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Carla sighed, running a hand through her hair. "The system we've been working on, one of the core integrations, it's not holding up under the load. We ran the stress tests, and it started throwing out errors left and right. If we don't fix it, this could delay the entire launch." Troy, who had been leading the technical side of the project, chimed in. "We've already tried patching the system, but the underlying problem is deeper than we thought. It's going to take more time to rebuild the framework from scratch." Malcolm's mind raced as he processed the information. A complete rebuild would almost certainly push them past the deadline, which could lead to massive complications for the company. But rushing through the fix wasn't an option either. They had worked too hard to let the quality of the project suffer. "How much time are we talking about?" Malcolm asked. Troy exchanged a glance with Carla before answering. "At least a week, maybe 2. We'll need to pull in extra resources and work around the clock to get it done, but it's possible." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, considering their options. A delay was inevitable at this point, but they needed to minimize the impact. He couldn't afford to let this setback derail everything they had accomplished so far. "Let's move forward with the rebuild," Malcolm said decisively. "We'll bring in the extra resources you need, but I want daily updates. We're going to stay on top of this and make sure it doesn't spiral out of control." Carla nodded, grateful for Malcolm's quick decision. "We'll get started right away. I'll keep you updated on our progress." As the meeting wrapped up, Malcolm felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was the kind of challenge his father had warned him about, the kind of pressure that could make or break a leader. But Malcolm wasn't going to let it overwhelm him. He had faced adversity before, and he would face it again. Later that evening, as Malcolm sat in his office reviewing the updated project plan, his phone buzzed with a message from his father. "I heard about the issue. Let's talk tomorrow." "Dad," Malcolm sighed, feeling the exhaustion of the day settling in. He knew his father would want to discuss the setback, but part of him dreaded the conversation. He had worked so hard to keep the project on track, and now it felt like everything was unraveling. The next morning, Malcolm made his way to his father's office for their scheduled meeting. David was already seated at his desk, his expression thoughtful as Malcolm entered. "Morning, Malcolm. Sit down," David said, motioning to the chair across from him. Malcolm sat, bracing himself for the conversation. "I assume you've heard about the issue with the integration." David nodded. "I have. Carla briefed me on the situation. It's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world either. These things happen." Malcolm exhaled, relieved that his father wasn't as disappointed as he had feared. "We're working on a solution. It's going to take time, but we're bringing in extra resources to make sure we minimize the delay." David leaned back in his chair, studying Malcolm closely. "You're handling this well, but I want you to remember something. Setbacks like this are inevitable in any major project. What matters is how you respond. You've made the right call by focusing on quality over speed, but don't let the pressure cloud your judgment. Stay focused on the end goal." Malcolm nodded, taking his father's advice to heart. "I won't let it get to me. We'll get it done, even if it takes a little longer." David smiled, his expression softening. "Good. That's what I like to hear. Just keep pushing forward. You've got the team behind you, and they trust your leadership. Don't forget that." Malcolm left the meeting feeling more grounded. His father's confidence in him was reassuring, and it reminded him that leadership wasn't about avoiding problems. It was about facing them head-on and finding solutions. As the days passed, Malcolm's team worked tirelessly to rebuild the system integration, and slowly but surely, progress was made. Troy and Carla led their teams with precision, while Malcolm ensured that the other departments stayed on track with the parts of the project that weren't affected by the delay. Each evening, Malcolm stayed late, reviewing the day's updates and planning for the next. He was determined to keep everything moving forward, even if it meant working longer hours and carrying the extra weight of responsibility. Failure wasn't an option, and Malcolm knew that the success of this project would define his future at Horizon Enterprises. But despite the long hours and intense pressure, Malcolm found himself growing more confident. He had learned to trust his team, to delegate where necessary, and to make the tough decisions when they were needed. He was becoming the leader his father had always believed he could be. One evening, as Malcolm was finishing up for the day, he received a call from Carla. Her voice was filled with excitement. "Malcolm, we've done it. The rebuild is complete, and the stress test passed with flying colors. We're back on track." Malcolm felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had done it. The setback had been significant, but the team had rallied, and they had managed to avoid a catastrophic delay. "That's incredible, Carla," Malcolm said, a smile spreading across his face. "Thank you for all the hard work." "I know it wasn't easy," Carla chuckled. "It's what we do, but honestly, you've been a great leader through all of this. The team trusts you, and that made a huge difference." Malcolm's chest swelled with pride. Hearing that from Carla meant everything. "I appreciate that, but this was a team effort, and I couldn't have done it without all of you." As he ended the call, Malcolm sat back in his chair, reflecting on how far he had come. The project was back on track, and the team was stronger than ever. But more than that, Malcolm had proven to himself and to everyone else that he was capable of leading under pressure. The real test had come, and Malcolm had passed. With the project back on track, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of confidence and determination. The hardest part was behind them, but Malcolm knew there was still work to be done. The final phases of the digital infrastructure overhaul required precision, collaboration, and leadership, and Malcolm was ready to see it through to the end. The team's morale had improved significantly since the system integration issue had been resolved. There was a sense of momentum, as if everyone could see the finish line in sight. Carla and Troy continued to lead the technical side with efficiency, while Malcolm focused on coordinating the remaining tasks and ensuring that the different departments were aligned. One morning, as Malcolm prepared for a status meeting with the executive team, he received a message from Amanda, his father's assistant. "David wants to meet with you this afternoon. There's something he'd like to discuss." Amanda. Malcolm frowned slightly, wondering what his father wanted to talk about. It wasn't unusual for David to check in on the project, but the timing seemed a bit curious. Still, Malcolm knew that whatever the meeting was about, it would be important. At the status meeting, Malcolm stood before the executive team, presenting the latest updates on the project's progress. The presentation went smoothly, with all departments reporting that they were on schedule to meet the adjusted deadline. The executives, who had been cautiously optimistic after the initial setback, seemed genuinely impressed with how Malcolm and his team had navigated the challenges. As the meeting wrapped up, Evelyn, the head of operations, approached Malcolm with a smile. "You've done an impressive job with this project," she said, shaking his hand. "I've seen a lot of projects like this fall apart under pressure, but you kept it together. That's leadership." Malcolm smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you, Evelyn. It wasn't easy, but we had a great team behind us." Evelyn nodded, her expression serious but approving. "Keep it up. This company needs people like you." Malcolm left the meeting feeling a surge of pride. He had earned the respect of the executive team, something that would be critical as he continued to grow within the company. But as he walked back to his office, the thought of his father's upcoming meeting lingered in his mind. What could it be about? That afternoon, Malcolm made his way to his father's office, feeling a mix of anticipation and curiosity. When he arrived, Amanda greeted him with a knowing smile before opening the door. "Go on in, Malcolm. He's expecting you." David was standing by the window, as he often did, gazing out at the city skyline. When Malcolm entered, David turned and smiled, motioning for him to sit. "Malcolm, good to see you," David said, his tone warm and relaxed. "How's everything going with the project?" Malcolm sat down, feeling a little more at ease. "It's going well. We're on track to meet the deadline, and the team's working hard. The system integration issue was a setback, but we've managed to recover." David nodded, clearly pleased. "I've been following the updates closely. You handled that situation with the integration very well. You made the right call and you didn't let the pressure cloud your judgment. Malcolm smiled, grateful for his father's praise. Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without the team. David leaned back in his chair, studying Malcolm for a moment before speaking again. I wanted to talk to you about something else, something beyond the project. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, sensing that this was the real reason for the meeting. What's on your mind? David took a deep breath, his expression growing more serious. You've done an outstanding job leading this project, Malcolm. You've shown that you can handle the pressure, make tough decisions, and earn the respect of your team. And now, I think it's time we talk about your future at Horizon. Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for this conversation, but now that it was happening, the weight of it felt immense. David continued, his voice calm but firm. I've been thinking a lot about the direction of the company and where we're headed in the next few years. We're entering a period of growth and innovation, and we need strong leadership to guide us through that. You've proven that you're ready for more responsibility, and I want to start preparing you for a larger role. Malcolm sat back, absorbing his father's words. This was more than just a promotion. His father was talking about preparing him for a leadership role that could shape the future of the company, perhaps even taking over one day. I'm ready, Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. Whatever comes next, I'm ready. David smiled, clearly pleased with Malcolm's response. I knew you would be. We're going to start involving you in more strategic decisions, beyond just the projects. You'll be working closely with the executive team, and I want you to start thinking about the bigger picture. Malcolm nodded, feeling the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about managing projects. This was about shaping the direction of Horizon Enterprises. It was the kind of responsibility he had always dreamed of. But now that it was within reach, the enormity of it was daunting. I'm ready to take it on, Malcolm repeated, his determination clear. David stood, walking around the desk to place a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. You've done an incredible job, Malcolm. I'm proud of the man you've become, and I know you're going to do great things here. But remember, leadership is a journey. You're going to face challenges, setbacks, and difficult decisions, but I have no doubt that you'll rise to meet them. Malcolm stood as well, feeling the weight of his father's words. Thanks, Dad. I won't let you down. David smiled warmly, a rare look of pride crossing his face. I know you won't. As Malcolm left his father's office, he felt a mixture of excitement and responsibility. This was the moment he had been working toward, the chance to step into a larger role at Horizon Enterprises. But with that opportunity came the understanding that the challenges would only grow more intense. Malcolm knew he would need to stay focused, humble, and determined if he was going to succeed. Back at his desk, Malcolm began reviewing the final stages of the project. The deadline was approaching, and the team was pushing harder than ever to ensure that everything was completed on time. It was the culmination of months of hard work, and Malcolm wanted to make sure that every detail was perfect. But even as he focused on the task at hand, his mind couldn't help but wander to the future. What would his new role look like? How would he navigate the complexities of leadership at a higher level? And what kind of legacy did he want to build at Horizon Enterprises? These questions lingered in his mind as he worked late into the evening, determined to finish what he had started. The project was almost complete, but Malcolm knew that this was only the beginning of his journey. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but Malcolm was ready to face them head-on. A few days later, the project reached its final milestone. The digital infrastructure overhaul was complete, and the team had delivered on every aspect of the plan. It was a major success, and Malcolm couldn't have been more proud of what they had accomplished. The executives were thrilled with the results, and even Carla, who was known for being a tough critic, had nothing but praise for Malcolm and his team. As the company prepared to launch the new system, Malcolm felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had proven himself, not just as the CEO's son, but as a leader in his own right. That evening, Malcolm received a call from his father. Malcolm, I just wanted to say congratulations. You and your team did an incredible job. This project is going to set the company up for success for years to come. Malcolm smiled, feeling the pride in his father's voice. Thanks, Dad. It was a team effort, but I'm really proud of what we've done. You should be, David said, his tone serious but warm. And this is just the beginning, Malcolm. There's a lot more ahead, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you'll shape the future of Horizon. Malcolm nodded, even though his father couldn't see him. Me too, Dad. Me too. As the call ended, Malcolm sat back, reflecting on the journey he had been on. From the challenges with Stephen to leading one of the company's most important projects, he had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated. But now, with the project behind him, he was ready to step into the next chapter. With the successful completion of the digital infrastructure overhaul, Malcolm felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The project had not only transformed Horizon Enterprises, but had also solidified his role within the company. Now he stood at the precipice of a new journey, one that involved greater responsibilities and the opportunity to shape the company's future. In the weeks following the project's launch, the company celebrated its success with a formal event. Executives, team members, and stakeholders gathered in the grand conference room, which had been beautifully decorated for the occasion. Malcolm could feel the energy in the room: excitement, pride, and a shared sense of accomplishment. David stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding as he addressed the audience. Tonight, we celebrate not just a project completed, but the hard work, dedication, and innovation that each of you has brought to Horizon Enterprises. This digital overhaul is just the beginning of what we can achieve when we work together. The room erupted in applause, and Malcolm felt a surge of pride as he looked around. His team had worked tirelessly to make this project a success, and now they were being recognized for their efforts. After the speeches, David motioned for Malcolm to join him at the front. "I'd like to invite my son Malcolm to say a few words," he announced, his tone warm and inviting. Malcolm hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment. He wasn't just the CEO's son standing before everyone. He was a leader in his own right, and this was his chance to address the team. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Thank you, Dad," he began, his voice steady. "I'm honored to be here tonight and to have played a part in this project. But more than that, I'm grateful for the incredible team we have at Horizon Enterprises. Each of you brought your talents and passion to this project, and it wouldn't have been the success it is without your hard work." Malcolm scanned the room, locking eyes with Carla, Troy, and the other team members who had fought alongside him through challenges and triumphs. "This experience has taught me so much about leadership, collaboration, and resilience. I've learned that it's not just about achieving goals, it's about supporting each other, growing together, and believing in one another." As he spoke, Malcolm felt the energy in the room shift. People were listening, engaged, and nodding in agreement. "I look forward to what's next for us as a company. This is just the beginning, and together, we can achieve even greater heights." The room erupted into applause again, and Malcolm stepped back, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had found his voice, not just as the CEO's son, but as a leader who was ready to embrace the challenges ahead. After the event, as people mingled and celebrated, Malcolm felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Evelyn approaching him with a smile. "Great speech, Malcolm. You've really come into your own," she said, her tone genuine. "Thank you, Evelyn. I appreciate that," he replied, feeling a sense of camaraderie with her. "It means a lot coming from you. I'm looking forward to seeing how you'll contribute to the future of this company. We need fresh perspectives like yours," she said, her expression sincere. As the evening progressed, Malcolm enjoyed the atmosphere of celebration. People were mingling, sharing stories about the project, and discussing what lay ahead. It was a vibrant reminder of the strong community they had built at Horizon Enterprises. Eventually, Malcolm found himself standing next to his father at the bar. David had a proud smile on his face as he watched the festivities. "You did well tonight," he said, clapping Malcolm on the back. "You've earned the respect of the team, and they see you as a leader." Malcolm felt a swell of pride at his father's words. "Thanks, Dad. It's been a journey, but I'm grateful for the support you've given me." David nodded, his expression turning serious. "Just remember, leadership is about more than just getting results. It's about inspiring others and making tough decisions. As you take on more responsibilities, you'll face challenges that will test your character. Stay true to yourself, and don't lose sight of the values that got you here." "I won't forget," Malcolm assured him. "I've learned so much from you and the team. I'm ready for whatever comes next." David smiled, his pride evident. "I know you are, and I'm excited to see where this journey takes you." As the celebration continued, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was ready to embrace the next chapter of his career, one that would not only test his abilities, but also allow him to impact Horizon Enterprises profoundly. He had proven himself not just to others, but to himself. He was no longer just the CEO's son. He was Malcolm Davis, a leader in his own right. In the weeks following the celebration, Malcolm began to take on more significant responsibilities within the company. David started involving him in strategic meetings, offering insights into the long-term vision of Horizon Enterprises. Malcolm felt a sense of fulfillment as he contributed to discussions about the company's future direction, a feeling he had longed for since joining the firm. As Malcolm navigated his new responsibilities, he faced challenges that tested his decision-making skills and leadership abilities. There were moments of doubt, But with each obstacle, he relied on the lessons he had learned from his father and his experiences throughout the project. One afternoon, during a high-stakes meeting with potential investors, Malcolm found himself at the forefront of the discussion. The stakes were high, and the investors were looking for assurance that Horizon Enterprises was poised for growth. As he presented the data and shared the company's vision, he felt the weight of expectations on his shoulders. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, Malcolm rose to the occasion. He articulated his points clearly, backed by data, and answered tough questions with confidence. By the end of the meeting, the investors were visibly impressed, and Malcolm could see the respect in their eyes. When the meeting concluded, David pulled Malcolm aside, a proud smile on his face. "You handled that exceptionally well. You've shown that you belong at this level." Malcolm beamed, feeling a rush of validation. "Thank you, Dad. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. Just remember, this is only the beginning. The real work starts now," David said, his expression serious yet encouraging. "Continue to build relationships and always be open to learning." As the months passed, Malcolm continued to grow within the company. He became a trusted leader, not just in projects, but in strategic planning and long-term initiatives. He formed bonds with his team, earning their trust and respect, and they all worked together toward a common goal: building a brighter future for Horizon Enterprises. As he reflected on his journey, Malcolm realized how far he had come. The challenges he had faced had shaped him into the leader he was becoming, and he was grateful for every moment. From the initial struggles with Stephen to leading a high-profile project and now influencing the company's future, he had proven to himself that he was more than capable. One evening, as Malcolm prepared to leave the office, he received a message from Carla. "Malcolm, can you meet me in the main conference room? I have something important to discuss." Curiosity piqued, Malcolm made his way to the conference room. When he arrived, he found Carla waiting for him, a serious expression on her face. "Hey, thanks for coming," she said, her tone a mix of urgency and excitement. "I've been working on something related to our next project, and I think you'll want to see it." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have?" Carla pulled up a presentation on the screen, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "This is a proposal for an innovative approach to enhance our digital capabilities even further. I believe it could position us as leaders in our industry." Malcolm felt a rush of excitement as he listened to Carla outline her ideas. This was the kind of forward-thinking project that could propel Horizon Enterprises into the next era of digital innovation. It was exactly what he had envisioned for the future. "I love this, Carla," Malcolm said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "Let's present it to the executive team next week. This could be our next big step." As they discussed the details and refined the proposal, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was what leadership was about: embracing new ideas, fostering collaboration, and driving the company toward success. Malcolm had proven himself time and time again, and as he looked ahead, he knew that he was on the right path. With each challenge he faced and each victory he achieved, he was not only solidifying his role within Horizon Enterprises, but also carving out a legacy of his own. The journey was far from over, but Malcolm was ready for whatever lay ahead. With determination in his heart and the support of his team behind him, he would continue to lead with integrity, resilience, and vision.